Spirit of God, that hovered over the waters and brought forth life, we pray that your Spirit hover over these words and hover over our lives, so that these might become your living words and we might become your living witnesses. To this end, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each one of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. We are reading from Genesis again, this time in chapter 9, verses 12 through 15. Let us listen for what the Spirit, 12 through 17. Listen for what the Spirit may be speaking to the church. God speaks. As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me, you, and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it, and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I establish between me and all flesh that is on the earth." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I want to begin this morning by way of a bit of confession. The truth is that the Noah story is one that's held very little interest for me at all. In Sunday school, I learned, like most of us, that it was about the animals, 2 by 2, and the number of the days in the flood, and the doves, and the olive branch, and finally the rainbow. And I was always left with this sneaking suspicion and hope that I sure hoped I was like Noah and didn't end up dead like the rest of the folks. It's a difficult passage if you think about that, but I'm not going to spend time on the part of the destruction. It is worth our attention, but what I want to focus on today is something a bit different. As I got older, I began to just basically assume that this Noah story was really just an ancient people's way of telling how rainbows came about. And after I learned in science class that rainbows are actually created from light refraction through water vapor, I really had very little interest in the Noah story. I was rather bright. So if that's the case, what is the point then of us talking about this Noah story today, and we're only focusing on a small part of it? Well, I actually believe that by focusing on this story, that it can teach us something about addressing the climate crisis. This week, our journey is to understand how our faith may have something to teach us about how to respond faithfully. And so this week, we're actually talking about one of the aspects known as soil degradation. It's not often talked about when it comes to climate science, at least in the public arena. We're still busy arguing on whether or not the scientists know what they're talking about. I'm going to assume that argument and move forward. And it is my belief that the Noah story, more specifically the Noah covenant, that begins to offer us some clues about how to faithfully engage, particularly this issue. We pick up the story where I started reading. It's not the normal place to pick it up, but I pick up where God confirms and reaffirms the covenant with Noah. God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations." That's the quote. In this passage, it is clear that while the promise is for Noah and the descendants, human beings, that it does not end there. Every living creature is included in the promise. But it is in our human arrogance that makes us think that we're on top of it all alone, that everything else is just window dressing for our personal lives. But just like the creation story, we end up being an afterthought in some ways on day 6. It does not revolve solely around us as human beings. Instead, what we find in these stories of creation and the prehistory texts in the ancient book of Genesis is that we are part of a web. We are part of a web of life, not the linchpin of the whole thing. And if that was not enough, God continues with what I think is a theme that is often overlooked. Did you hear? I've set my bow in the clouds, God speaks, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. There's no mention of human beings or all the living creatures. The earth is given a special category, and it wasn't until I was able to contemplate the possibilities of this passage that I didn't see it. I always assumed that earth just meant all of us. But it doesn't, because it gets set aside specially in here. For most of my life, I heard that the passage was not about earth, that it basically was about us as human beings. But that is an arrogance. Because what's going on here is not about the human beings and every living creature. Within the passage, that is said repeatedly, but here it's left out. And anything we know about biblical stories, particularly the way Hebrew stories get told, when something gets left out in a repetitious story like this, we're supposed to notice it. We're supposed to know that this isn't an accident. This isn't just about storytelling where you left off some details. No, this is actually a very clear statement from God that the covenant is between God and the earth. And then there's a covenant for us and the living creatures. But notice, we don't get the covenant alone. It's always with the living creatures. Those have already been included. But here the covenant, the rainbow, isn't even for us. It's for the earth, which we need to live on. We need the earth does not need us. Here's the thing, in most of the academic circles, even little attention has been played on this covenant with the earth in Genesis 9. The focus, as most of the commentaries, has always been about Noah and the creatures and the future generations. But there's one exception, Miguel de la Torre. He's a professor of social ethics and Latinx studies at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver. And this is what he says about this particular passage. The covenant made with Noah is not exclusively with the people of Israel. It is a covenant made with all of creation. The well-beings of humans will from now on be intertwined with the well-being of the entire planet and all forms of life that are contained therein. End quote. In other words, the planet is special to God. In and of itself, not because we're here, but the planet, in and of itself, is special to God. And it is in this, it is because of this, that the earth deserves our special attention. Earth is specifically named by God in the covenant. And so in this passage, earth changed from being a location for human beings and all living creatures, but to being in relationship with God. The earth is special to God. It is an entity within the Scriptures, and because so, it demands our attention. But our connection to the earth goes way deeper than God cares for it, so should we. We have to go back to the beginning, the second creation story, Genesis 2. In the beginning, the connection between human beings and the earth is one of those foundational stories of our faith. In Genesis chapter 2, at the creation of human beings, we proclaim that human beings are created from the dust of the earth, the dirt of the earth. We are dirt people. Even in the words chosen for the story, the connection's clear. See, the Hebrew word for earth is Adamah. And the Hebrew word for human, non-gendered by the way, is Adam, or Adam. Adam's not a boy's name, it's a Hebrew name for dirt people. We're connected to the earth. Adamah. Adam. Or human. And humus. Humus of the earth. We're connected to the earth whether we want to admit it or not. From dirt we have come, from dirt we shall return. And we spend our whole lives thinking we're beyond creation. We can expand beyond that. We don't need it. Dr. Robert Williamson, who's an Old Testament professor at Hendrix College and also turns out to be a seminary classmate of mine, writes this, quote, "Human beings are fundamentally dirt. We are humans created from the humus. The ground is our birthplace and our final resting place. It isn't something separate from us. It is us, and we are it." And we have this connection. It is there in our foundational text. Human lives, human beings come from the earth. It is the breath of God that gives us life, but we are forever connected to the earth on which we stand. And if we ignore this reality, Williamson continues, quote, "we try to separate the atom from the atoma, the human from the humus, we hasten our own demise." Unfortunately, we have been hastening our own demise. The earth, more specifically, the soil of the earth, the dust, the stuff of us, is in bad shape. And if the idea that we have an intimate connection to the earth is not enough to move us to care, consider that unhealthy soil will not only eventually cause us harm, it will kill us off. In a recent report on soil, we've learned that about 3.2 billion people, that's almost half the world's population, are suffering because of degraded soils. And how do we know that's the case? A few years ago, Esther Ngabi, who is a Clinton Global Initiative University mentor and researcher, put a very fine point on the implications around our unhealthy soils. She said, quote, "Unhealthy soils do not contain enough nutrients to support crop growth, leading to systemic food and nutrient security problems. Lower yields result in worldwide hunger and malnutrition, as well as amplified food price volatility, sending millions into poverty. Without a way to afford food, hungry people may turn to alternative sources of income, such as joining a terrorist group. This is a looming crisis," she continues. "To ensure global health and security, we must start by rehabilitating our degraded soils." When we do not take care of the soil, it becomes depleted of nutrients, and it will cease to be able to produce enough food. The health of our soil isn't just about care for the earth. It's not just about being able to eat. It is a global security issue. But as with most aspects of the climate crisis, food is not the only issue when it comes to the health of soil. Soil is important because it also stores carbon. When we do not care for the soil, when we do mass deforestation, when Amazon forests burn, that carbon is released into the atmosphere. And there is at least 3 times more carbon in the soil than there is in the atmosphere. But that carbon being released will drive us to extinction. Unlike other resources, soil takes a really long time to make. It can take between 500 and 1,000 years for just 1 centimeter of topsoil to be produced. So there's an urgency in responding to this crisis. And now you're probably wondering, okay, get to the good news because this is really scary. Well, the good news is that there are things that we can do and that are being done, which we can individually and collectively do. There's a whole movement called Regeneration. Regeneration International. This idea of regenerating the soil is happening, and it's happening not just in small places, but on scale. It is repeatable and doable throughout the world. In fact, if you listen closely, and you might have heard this, in the most recent Democratic presidential debate, one of the candidates even mentioned regenerative agriculture, and I about fell out my chair. There are several organizations working to bring back life to the soil. And at its heart, what it does is remove petroleum-based products. The because we can't use enough fertilizer based out of petroleum products and enough enhancement, because eventually the soil will die. It removes petroleum-based products from the process. It includes the uses of animals, low-till practices, crop rotation, and many others. For those of you that aren't farmers, if I lost you all there, it's okay. Basically, they're going back and doing what generations before us knew how to take care of the soil. We're finally listening to the ancestors. The good news is that there is something that can be done on a larger scale, despite what critics will continue to say. It can seem overwhelming when we consider the crisis. But there is something that each one of us can do. Let me give you a good news story. Some of you might have heard that the goal, or what we ought to do to deal with climate change, is just stop eating meat. Anybody heard that before? So there's an argument going on around this, and I don't want to go on too long, but there was the CEO of Impossible Burger, the company that is doing this, claiming that regenerative agriculture wouldn't work. And it turns out there are some examples of this, one being White Oak Pastures. They actually have a negative footprint, and they are selling meat to eat. And they're doing it on scale. And they've invited the CEO to come and to see what's happening, because they have learned how to trap carbon in the soil by simply old practices. Again, listening to the ancestors. But it's not just about what can be done out there, it's also stuff that we can do. The first step is to go back to these foundational stories of our faith and realize that care of the soil is care of us. That we're in relationship with God and the creatures and the earth, and God wants that connection together. And when any one of those are out of whack, no one can be fully healthy. It is, in the end, justice for the earth. And if there is no justice for the earth, then there's a threat to justice everywhere. We have to go back to the foundational stories of our faith and realize that we are part of the network, not the center of the universe. And then we have to do some homework to understand the issues more fully, to listen beyond the headlines and the foolish arguments, and then decide how we are called to change. It might begin in your backyard, or how you approach food choices. For others, it may mean advocacy. But know this, no matter where and in no matter what capacity you choose, you have a choice and a part to play. It does not have to be everything. It can be simply one thing. After all, human beings came from the earth. And while life breath comes from God, human beings are forever connected with the earth. And if we ignore this reality, Williamson continues, if we try to separate the atom from the atomad, from the human from the humus, we hasten our own demise. As followers of Jesus, we have the ability to face the crosses of our day, the suffering and the troubles of the day, and not in despair, not in resignation, but instead we know that no matter the trouble, that God's desire is for new life, for all of humans and the descendants of Noah, for all the living creatures, and for earth as its entity. But just simply believing in new life does not make it happen. It comes through our being honest about being real and about admitting what is wrong and taking action to change what is not working, even if it seems that we cannot change things. We remember that in God, we know the cross was not the end of the story. We know that the tomb is not the end of the story. The tomb was empty. New life. New life can come in our bodies, in our earth, in our times, and in our soil from which we've come, to which we will return. So let us go forth with the hope, and then use that hope to act in hopeful ways.